October 1913. Jung is 38 years old, sitting at his desk in Küsnacht, Switzerland, his career in free fall. He picks up a journal, hand-bound, heavier than it needs to be, and opens to the first page. He writes the first words in red ink. What he puts down in that journal over the next 16 years will be kept from the world for nearly a century. His family will seal it inside a bank vault. Scholars will spend decades begging to see it. The estate will refuse every request. The lock will hold for 48 years after his death. The question that should bother you is simple. What was in it that no one was allowed to read? Most people who know Jung's name have never heard of the Red Book. That fact alone should tell you something. Everything taught about Jung in psychology courses, the shadow, the persona, individuation, the collective unconscious, all of it was born inside this book. Every concept, every framework, every idea that made him one of the most referenced psychologists in history emerged from what he wrote and painted across those pages. But the source material, the raw encounter that generated all of it, was hidden. The theories were allowed out. The experience they came from was locked away. The book itself is unlike anything else in the psychological literature. 205 pages, hand-lettered in medieval calligraphy, illustrated with full-color paintings Jung created himself. It looks less like a work of psychology and more like an illuminated manuscript from the 13th century, something you'd find in a monastery, behind glass, written by a monk who'd lost his grip on the ordinary world. When it was finally published in 2009, the edition weighed nearly 15 pounds and cost almost $200. Jung himself called it the prima materia, the raw material, for everything he would later become. And for nearly half a century, it sat in darkness, inside a literal locked room in a Swiss bank, waiting. Today, I'm going to walk you through what the Red Book actually is, why it was hidden, what Jung found inside his own mind during those 16 years that made the book too dangerous to publish while he was alive, and why what he discovered about the nature of reality still carries enough force to unsettle anyone willing to sit with it honestly. Because the Red Book isn't a historical curiosity, it's a confrontation, one that most people, if they understood what it was actually saying, would do everything in their power to avoid. To understand why the book exists at all, you have to understand the year that broke Jung open. By 1912, he was one of the most prominent young psychiatrists in Europe. Freud had essentially anointed him as the heir to the psychoanalytic movement. Jung had a thriving practice, international recognition, a growing family, a career trajectory that looked, from every external angle, like the model of professional success. And then he published a book called Symbols of Transformation, and the whole thing collapsed. The book directly contradicted Freud's theory of the libido. Jung argued that psychic energy wasn't primarily sexual, that it was something broader, more fundamental, more connected to the human need for meaning than the human need for pleasure. Freud took this as betrayal. The friendship ended. The professional relationship ended. Jung's position within the psychoanalytic movement evaporated almost overnight, and with it went his sense of intellectual direction, his community, and the professional identity he'd spent a decade constructing. What followed was something that, described from the outside, sounds like a psychiatric emergency. Jung stopped sleeping normally. He started having waking visions, vivid, uninvited images that arrived during ordinary hours, while he was eating breakfast, while he was seeing patients. He heard voices. He had experiences that he could only describe as premonitory. Fantasies of Europe drowning in blood, rivers turning red, the earth heaving and splitting. He initially interpreted these as evidence that he was losing his mind, that something in his psyche had snapped under the weight of the professional rupture and was now producing hallucinations. He seriously considered checking himself into his own clinic. 3 months later, the First World War began. The blood he'd seen flooding Europe wasn't metaphor, it was happening. And Jung was left with a question that would determine the course of the rest of his life. A question with no comfortable answer. Had he seen something real? Was what was rising from underneath his conscious mind something other than psychosis? Was it possible that the unconscious had access to information that the waking mind did not? Most psychiatrists in his position would have done the sensible thing. They would have suppressed the visions, committed harder to professional routine, chalked the whole experience up to stress, and moved on. Jung did the opposite. He made a decision that he would later call the most important and most terrifying choice of his life. He decided to follow the visions, to go toward whatever was pulling at him from underneath his rational identity, rather than away from it. To treat the unconscious as if it had something to say and then actually listen. What this looked like, in practice, was strange enough that Jung only described it fully decades later. Every afternoon, he went to the shore of Lake Zurich and built small structures out of stones, a miniature village, a church, houses. He was a middle-aged psychiatrist with an international reputation, kneeling in the dirt like a child, stacking rocks. He knew how it looked. He did it anyway, because something in the activity opened a door in his mind that intellectual effort couldn't reach. In the evenings, he sat in a chair in his study and deliberately let his mind fall. He didn't meditate in any structured sense. He just released his grip on rational thought and allowed whatever was waiting below to rise. What rose was overwhelming. Images, figures, voices, entire scenes that played out with a vividness he compared to waking dreams. He wrote everything down. He sketched. He transcribed the dialogues he had with the presences that appeared. These raw notes became the first layer of what would eventually become the Red Book, chaotic, frightening, written in the handwriting of a man who wasn't sure whether he was documenting a breakthrough or a breakdown. Over the years that followed, Jung went back to these raw notes and began transcribing them into something more permanent. He chose red ink, then black. He taught himself calligraphy. He painted the visions in full color, images that are, by any standard, extraordinary. Snakes and mandalas and figures from mythology he hadn't consciously studied. The journal became an illuminated manuscript, a work of art, a document that Jung treated with a seriousness that bordered on reverence. He wasn't just recording his inner life. He believed he was preserving something that had been given to him, something that didn't entirely belong to him, and therefore couldn't be treated casually. The figures Jung encountered in the visions weren't random. That's the part that disturbed him most, and it's the part that should disturb you too. What he found when he descended beneath his conscious identity wasn't noise or chaos or the meaningless debris of a stressed psyche. He found what he experienced as autonomous presences, figures with their own perspectives, their own knowledge, their own agendas that didn't match his conscious intentions. The first pair appeared together. An old man he identified with the prophet Elijah, and a blind young woman he associated with Salome, the biblical figure who demanded the head of John the Baptist. The pairing made no sense to him. An ancient prophet and a woman associated with seduction and death, arriving side by side, speaking to him as if they'd been waiting. Jung didn't choose these figures. He didn't construct them the way you construct characters in a novel. They arrived. They had things to say that he didn't expect. They behaved in ways that contradicted his conscious assumptions. Then came Philemon, an old man with the horns of a bull and the wings of a kingfisher, carrying a set of keys. Of all the figures Jung encountered during those years, Philemon was the one who changed him most profoundly. Philemon became something like a teacher, a presence Jung held extended conversations with, who communicated ideas that Jung did not consciously possess. Jung was explicit about this point, and he returned to it throughout his life with a kind of insistence that made his more rational colleagues deeply uncomfortable. Philemon was not a product of imagination in any ordinary sense. The figure seemed to have independent existence. He said things Jung didn't already know. He corrected Jung's thinking. He introduced perspectives that Jung's conscious mind had never considered. Jung later wrote that Philemon taught him something he called psychic objectivity, the understanding that there are contents in the psyche that are not produced by the conscious mind and cannot be fully controlled by it, that the unconscious is populated, that it contains intelligences, perspectives, forces that are, in some meaningful sense, other. This was the first dangerous idea in the Red Book, and Jung knew exactly how dangerous it was. He was a psychiatrist. He treated patients who heard voices and saw figures. He knew the diagnostic categories. And he was saying, from inside his own experience, that the diagnostic categories were too small. That some of what psychiatry called psychosis was contact with a layer of reality that most people never access, and that the profession had no framework for understanding. He wasn't claiming that every person who hears voices is having a legitimate encounter with the unconscious. He was far too careful for that. What he was claiming was more precise and, in its own way, more unsettling. That the boundary between the inner world and mental illness is not where mainstream psychiatry draws it. That there is a territory between ordinary consciousness and psychosis that is real, that can be navigated, that contains genuine knowledge, and that almost no one in the Western world is taught how to enter safely. The Red Book is his map of that territory, drawn from the inside in red ink with paintings. And his family looked at this map and decided the world couldn't have it. Understanding why requires looking at what Jung himself said about the book and what he didn't say. He told his family it was his most important work. He spent more time on it than on any of his published writings. But he also told them it was dangerous, and he used that word deliberately. He deliberated for decades about whether to publish it, and he never did. He died in 1961 with the book still in manuscript form, and his son Franz moved it to the bank vault shortly after. The surface explanation for keeping it hidden is professional. The Red Book doesn't read like psychology. It reads like mysticism, like visionary literature, like something written by a medieval theologian in the grip of divine encounter. If it had been published during Jung's lifetime, it could have destroyed his credibility as a scientist. The psychiatric establishment was already skeptical of him, already inclined to dismiss his ideas about the collective unconscious as unscientific speculation. Publishing a hand-painted manuscript full of conversations with autonomous figures would have given his critics everything they needed to write him off entirely. But the deeper reason goes beyond professional risk. The Red Book doesn't just describe Jung's inner life. It makes claims about the nature of reality, claims that contradicted the entire materialist framework that Western science had spent 2 centuries constructing. The book argues, through experience rather than theory, that the inner world is as real as the external one, that it operates according to its own laws, that it contains knowledge the conscious mind cannot access through rational means, that everything we've built our civilization on, the assumption that what's measurable and external is primary, and what's internal and subjective is secondary, might be exactly backwards. The Jung estate kept the book locked away for 48 years. When a scholar named Sonu Shamdasani finally spent years negotiating for the right to publish it, navigating family politics, legal obstacles, the reluctance of heirs who weren't sure the world was ready, what he found when he opened the vault and examined the manuscript made him say, on the record, that it was the most important unpublished work in the history of psychology. He wasn't being dramatic, he was being specific. The book contained the source code for an entire school of psychological thought, and the source code was far stranger, far more radical, and far more unsettling than the polished theories that had been extracted from it. The locked room in the Swiss bank wasn't metaphorical. It was a physical space with a physical lock, and the book sat inside it for nearly half a century, while the ideas it generated traveled the world without their origin story. The shadow, the persona, individuation, the collective unconscious, all of these became part of the psychological vocabulary of the 20th century. But the experience that generated them, the 16 years of descent that made them possible, the raw encounter with something that Jung himself struggled to name, that stayed in the vault. The children were allowed out. The mother was kept in the dark. And that pattern, the ideas released, the experience suppressed, tells you more about the book's danger than anything written on its pages. Because ideas can be managed, ideas can be debated, qualified, absorbed into existing frameworks, domesticated. An experience of the kind the Red Book describes cannot be managed. It demands something of the reader. It implies that the locked room isn't just in a Swiss bank, that every person carries a version of it, that the vault has been holding something for years, possibly decades, and that the question of whether to open it is the question the book keeps asking, on every page, in red ink, with paintings. This is where the surface history ends and the real excavation begins. Because what's in that book, what Jung actually found when he followed the visions into the territory beneath his conscious identity, isn't a story about one man's psychology. It's a set of claims about the nature of reality that most people are never allowed to hear clearly stated. And the reason they aren't allowed to hear them has less to do with their truth and more to do with what those claims would require of anyone who took them seriously. Jung spent 16 years going into the rooms that most people keep sealed their entire lives. The locked doors he opened weren't in a bank vault. They were in the deepest layers of his own psyche, and what he found there became the foundation for everything he taught. If you felt that pull toward your own depths, that persistent knock from something underneath the surface of your daily life, the reflection exercises in our guide, True Self-Discovery, were built for exactly that threshold. 24 practices drawn from Jung's teachings, designed for the descent rather than the surface. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. But stay with me here, because what Jung found on the other side of that descent changes everything about how we understand what's real. The Red Book opens with a distinction that, once you understand it, makes everything else in the book, and possibly everything else in your life, land differently. Jung didn't begin with theory. He began with two voices. He called them the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths, and he presented them as forces that had been competing inside him for years before the book was written, before the visions, before the rupture with Freud made the competition impossible to keep ignoring. The spirit of the times is the easier one to recognize because you've been listening to it your entire life. It's the voice of the era you were born into, the consensus, the shared agreement about what counts as real, what counts as valuable, what qualifies as knowledge, and what gets dismissed as delusion. In Jung's day, the spirit of the times was scientific materialism, the conviction that what's measurable and observable is primary, and everything else is either derivative or imaginary. In ours, it's something broader and harder to pin down. A combination of that same materialism with the digital certainty that reality is whatever can be captured, quantified, optimized, and shared. The spirit of the times tells you what a successful life looks like. It tells you what to pursue and what to dismiss. It provides the categories through which you sort every experience, every feeling, every encounter into something legible. And it does this so completely, so seamlessly, that you forget it's a filter. You start mistaking the filter for the world itself. The spirit of the depths is older, much older. It doesn't care about your career. It has no opinion about your social standing. It doesn't know what century you were born in, and it wouldn't adjust its demands if it did. The spirit of the depths is the voice that speaks in dreams you can't explain, in sudden knowing that arrives without evidence, in the persistent feeling that something is profoundly wrong with your life, even when everything appears to be working. It's the voice Jung had been hearing underneath his professional achievements for years, the one that got louder after the Freud rupture, louder still during the visions, and finally loud enough that it took over the Red Book entirely. What Jung wrote in those opening pages, stated with a directness that he rarely used in his published work, was that the spirit of the times is always incomplete, always. Regardless of the era, regardless of how advanced the science, regardless of how sophisticated the cultural framework, the spirit of the times, by its very nature, filters out everything the depths contain. It has to. If it didn't, the consensus would dissolve. The shared agreement about what's real would fracture. People would start paying attention to things that can't be measured, can't be optimized, can't be turned into productivity, and the entire structure that depends on them not paying attention to those things would begin to come apart. Jung wasn't making a philosophical argument when he wrote this. He was describing what had happened to him. He'd spent years living inside the spirit of the times, building credentials, publishing research, earning the respect of the psychiatric establishment, and the spirit of the depths had been knocking the entire time. He just couldn't hear it over the noise of his own ambition. When the noise finally stopped, when the Freud rupture stripped away his professional identity and the visions started flooding in, what he heard was a voice that had been trying to reach him for decades. And what it said essentially was, everything you've been treating as primary is secondary. Everything you've been dismissing as secondary is primary. You have the hierarchy exactly backwards. This leads directly into the Red Book's most fundamental claim, and it's the one that makes the book genuinely dangerous rather than merely interesting. Jung arrived at a position that he spent the rest of his career trying to articulate in language the academic world would accept, and he never quite succeeded, because the position itself resists academic framing. The position is this: the psyche is not a byproduct of the brain. The psyche is the medium through which all reality is experienced. Everything you will ever encounter, every object, every person, every event, every piece of what you call the external world, reaches you through your psyche. The sky you see isn't the sky, it's a psychic event. The color blue you perceive isn't a property of the atmosphere, it's a construction of your nervous system, filtered through your emotional state, your personal history, your language for describing what you're seeing. You have never, in your entire life, experienced anything that wasn't mediated by the psyche. Every single thing you've ever called real was, at the point of contact, a psychological event. This sounds like an abstraction until you follow it to where it leads. If everything is mediated by the psyche, then the psyche is not some interior appendix to external reality. The psyche is the only reality you have direct access to. The external world may well exist independently of your experience of it. Jung wasn't a solipsist. But your experience of it is always, irreducibly, psychological. And the unconscious layers of that psyche, the layers Jung spent 16 years mapping in the Red Book, are shaping your experience of reality at every moment. Selecting what you notice, determining what you feel, constructing the meaning you assign to events, filtering some things in and other things out based on criteria you have never examined because you didn't know the criteria existed. Follow this one step further. If the unconscious is constantly constructing your experience of reality, choosing what gets through and what doesn't, assigning emotional weight, providing the interpretive framework, then every person who has never examined their unconscious is living inside a reality that was assembled for them by something they've never looked at. Their relationships, their choices, their sense of what's possible, their understanding of who they are, all of it partially authored by material they've never consciously encountered. They believe they're making free choices inside an objective world. The Red Book's argument is that the world they're experiencing is already pre-shaped by forces operating beneath their awareness, and the choices they're making are already constrained by structures they've never examined. Think about someone, and maybe this someone is closer than you'd like to admit, who has spent 30 years building a life that looks, by every external standard, well organized. Good decisions, reasonable trajectory, the kind of biography that makes sense when you tell it at a dinner party. And underneath all of it, a pattern they've never looked at. The same kind of relationship, repeated with different faces. The same particular flavor of emptiness showing up every few years, managed with a new project or a new purchase or a new commitment that keeps the emptiness at bay for a while before it seeps back in, a little deeper each time. The same avoidance dressed in different clothing, sometimes as ambition, sometimes as busyness, sometimes as the conviction that they just haven't found the right thing yet. The Red Book's argument is that this person's external reality, the relationships, the choices, the recurring emptiness, is being shaped by something inside them they've never opened. And the life they're living on the surface is, in a very specific sense, a symptom of the room they've refused to enter. This is where the locked room motif stops being about a book in a Swiss bank vault and starts being about something considerably closer. The unconscious, in Jung's framework, is the room most people keep sealed for their entire lives. They can feel it. They can sense its weight on certain nights, in certain silences, in the particular quality of unease that arrives when the distractions stop and they're alone with themselves. They know something is in there. They have always known. The locking isn't ignorance. It's a choice that was made so early and reinforced so often that it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like the shape of reality itself. The Red Book goes further still, and here is where it moves into territory that made the Jung family afraid to publish it. Territory that makes both religious institutions and scientific ones deeply uncomfortable for completely different reasons. Jung wrote about God in the Red Book, extensively, but he didn't write about God the way a theologian writes about God. And he didn't write about God the way an atheist writes about the absence of God. He wrote about something that neither framework has room for, and that's precisely why it disturbed everyone. What Jung claimed, and what the Red Book documents through direct experience rather than argument, is that the image of God, the psychic reality of the divine, is a permanent, irreducible feature of the human unconscious. Every person carries it. Every person's life is being shaped by it, whether they call themselves religious or atheist or agnostic or anything else. The God image, in Jung's account, isn't a belief, it's a structure. It's built into the psyche the way depth perception is built into vision. You can refuse to believe in it. You can spend your entire intellectual life arguing against it. The structure doesn't care about your arguments, it keeps operating. During one of the vision sequences documented in the Red Book, Jung encountered this structure directly. He confronted the God image in his own psyche, and what he found there was nothing like what any religious tradition had prepared him to expect. The figure was dark, ambivalent, capable of creation and destruction in equal measure. It didn't match the benevolent father of Christianity. It didn't match the remote clockmaker of deism. It matched something older, something that existed before the theological frameworks were built to contain it, something that the frameworks were, in some sense, constructed to protect people from encountering directly. The implications of this move in two directions, and both of them cut. If you've left religion behind, if you consider yourself secular, rational, beyond the need for the sacred, the Red Book's claim is that the God image didn't leave when you did. It went underground. It attached itself to other objects. For some people, it attached to a career, the pursuit of professional achievement carrying all the psychological intensity of a religious vocation, complete with the guilt of falling short and the terror of meaninglessness if the pursuit fails. For others, it attached to a relationship, one particular person carrying the weight of the sacred, which is why their approval feels like salvation and their withdrawal feels like damnation. For others still, it attached to ideology, or to the narrative of their own suffering, or to the fantasy of a future self who would finally be worthy of the devotion they can't stop giving to something. The sacred impulse doesn't vanish when you stop using religious language for it. It finds other hosts, and the hosts it finds, when you don't know what's happening, tend to become obsessions, addictions, and dependencies that look nothing like religion but function identically. The cut goes the other direction too. If you're inside a religious framework, if you believe, practice, worship, the Red Book's claim is equally uncomfortable. Jung's argument is that belief can serve as a substitute for encounter, that you can accept every doctrine, perform every ritual, live inside the most detailed theological framework available, and never once make contact with the living force the framework points toward. The beliefs become a buffer. The rituals become routine. The framework becomes another version of the locked room, a structure that holds the God image at a safe distance, allows you to reference it without being touched by it, and protects you from the raw, disorienting, identity-dissolving experience of actually encountering what's at the bottom of your own psyche. Jung saw this pattern constantly. People who believed devoutly and lived entirely on the surface. The belief system had become, paradoxically, the mechanism preventing the very encounter it claimed to facilitate. What the Red Book demands, and this is the word, demands, because the book's tone on this point is closer to insistence than suggestion, is encounter rather than belief. A direct, unmediated confrontation with whatever lives in the deepest chamber of your own interior. And Jung's experience, documented across those 205 illuminated pages, was that this confrontation bears almost no resemblance to what either religion or secular psychology prepares you for. It is wilder, stranger, more frightening, and more real than any framework can capture. The frameworks are maps, the encounter is the territory. And the territory, as Jung discovered, has its own rules, its own inhabitants, and its own agenda that doesn't align neatly with anything the conscious mind has planned. There's one more claim the Red Book makes that needs to be stated before we can talk about what any of this means for the life you're actually living. It's the claim that ties everything else together, and Jung stated it with a clarity that was unusual for a man who tended to hedge his more radical positions in published work. In the Red Book, he didn't hedge. The claim is this: the absence of meaning is the primary source of human psychological suffering. Not trauma, though trauma compounds it. Not childhood wounds, though those provide the channels through which meaninglessness flows. The absence of genuine meaning, meaning that emerges from authentic contact with your own depths rather than from external achievement or cultural script, is what hollows a person out from the inside. A person can endure extraordinary external suffering if they find meaning in it. They can endure loss, isolation, physical pain, social rejection, and emerge with their psychological core intact, sometimes even strengthened. But a person surrounded by comfort, achievement, and social approval, who has no access to genuine meaning, will deteriorate psychologically in ways that look like depression, anxiety, addiction, and a restlessness that nothing external can quiet, because the problem was never external. This is not a vague spiritual observation. It's a specific psychological claim with specific implications. Modern life is built to deliver comfort. It is engineered for convenience, for stimulation, for the removal of friction, and it is spectacularly good at what it's built for. But genuine meaning, the kind that comes from encounter with the depths, from contact with the layers of the psyche that the spirit of the times actively suppresses, cannot be delivered. It can only be discovered. And the discovery requires descent. It requires going into the room. And every mechanism of modern life, from the phone in your pocket to the schedule that fills every hour to the performance of productivity that makes busyness feel like purpose, is designed, whether intentionally or not, to keep you from going there. If your life feels hollow despite looking functional, if there's a particular quality of emptiness that shows up in the quiet moments, the ones between obligations, the ones where nothing is technically wrong, and yet something is clearly, unmistakably missing. The Red Book's diagnosis has nothing to do with choosing wrong. You might have chosen well by every available standard. The diagnosis is that you haven't been in the room yet. You've been living entirely on the surface, managing the hollowness with things that work on the surface. And the hollowness persists because its source isn't on the surface. Its source is in the depths. And it will keep persisting. It will keep showing up at 4 in the morning, keep seeping through the cracks between achievements, keep making every success feel slightly less satisfying than the last, until the descent happens, or until you stop noticing, which is its own kind of loss. What the Red Book describes, this encounter with the depths, with the figures, with the meaning that lives beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness, can't be accessed by learning about it. Jung himself said this, more than once, with a frustration that's palpable in his letters and seminars. The knowledge in the Red Book is not the kind that transfers through intellectual understanding. You can read every page, understand every concept, appreciate the paintings, follow the philosophical arguments, and remain completely untouched. Because the knowledge is experiential. It lives in the encounter itself, in the moment of actually sitting with what's underneath, in the willingness to let go of the interpretive frameworks long enough to see what's there before interpretation gets to it. Which is exactly the problem, and Jung knew it was the problem. Most people don't know how to begin. The spirit of the times hasn't given them the tools, because the spirit of the times doesn't want them to go there. If you've been circling this threshold, sensing the depths, feeling the knock from underneath, but unsure how to move from sensing it to actually entering it, the reflection exercises in our guide, True Self-Discovery, were built for exactly that gap. 24 practices rooted in Jung's own approach to the encounter, designed to help you hear what's been waiting beneath the noise. The link is right below this video. But stay here, because the most important question the Red Book raises, the one that implicates you directly, the one most people will do everything in their power to avoid sitting with, is still ahead. One of the Red Book's most radical ideas is also one of its quietest. Jung never gave it a dramatic name. He never built a formal theory around it the way he did with the shadow or the collective unconscious. He just kept coming back to it across those 16 years of writing and painting and descending, as though the idea wouldn't let him go. He called it the personal myth. The concept is simple enough to state and devastating enough to sit with that most people hear it, nod, and immediately move on to something less threatening. Here it is. Your life is not a sequence of events. Your life is a myth in the making. It has a structure. It has recurring figures. It has a central wound that functions as the story's driving question, a question your life keeps asking you through every job you take, every relationship you enter, every crisis you manufacture or stumble into. And until you can read the structure, until you can see the myth your life has been enacting, the myth is writing you. You are a character in a story you've never read, following a plot you didn't choose, driven by a question you've never consciously asked. Jung arrived at this through the Red Book because the Red Book forced him to read his own life as a myth. He had to look at the figures that kept appearing in his visions and recognize them as versions of forces that had been shaping his choices for decades. The old man with the keys, Philemon, wasn't random. The blind young woman wasn't arbitrary. They corresponded to something in the architecture of his actual lived experience. His intellectual ambitions, his need for authority, his relationship with the feminine, his compulsive drive to understand. All of it had a mythic structure he'd been living inside without seeing. What disturbed him most was the realization that his professional identity, the decades of work, the publications, the patience, the institutional reputation, had been, in some sense, an elaborate detour. A way of circling the central question his life kept asking without ever facing it head-on. He'd been productive, he'd been brilliant, he'd been useful to thousands of people, and underneath all of it, he'd been avoiding the descent that the Red Book finally made unavoidable. This raises something you can feel even if you'd rather not. What is the central question your life keeps asking you? Through every situation that keeps recurring in slightly different forms, through every relationship that follows the same invisible template, through every version of the same emptiness that arrives no matter how many times you rearrange the external conditions. Have you ever actually looked at it directly? Or have you been building your own elaborate detours, productive ones, respectable ones, ones that look like purpose from the outside, around the thing your life keeps trying to show you? There's a reason most people never look, and the reason isn't personal weakness or lack of curiosity. The reason is structural. The institutions that organize human life, religious institutions, educational institutions, economic institutions, even therapeutic institutions, are designed, whether consciously or not, to keep people on the surface. And the Red Book helps explain why. Jung wasn't the first person to describe the kind of interior encounter the Red Book documents. The Gnostic Gospels describe something remarkably similar, a direct encounter with divine knowledge that bypasses institutional authority. The mystical traditions within Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, all of them contain accounts of individuals who went inward, found something alive in the depths, and came back changed in ways that made them difficult for existing power structures to manage. The Sufi mystics, the Desert Fathers, Meister Eckhart, who was tried for heresy, the alchemical texts Jung studied obsessively, those too described a process of interior transformation that looked, from the outside, like madness or blasphemy. Every single one of these traditions was suppressed, marginalized, or declared dangerous by the dominant institutions of its era. The pattern is so consistent across centuries and cultures that it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like something closer to a law. Institutions suppress interior encounter because interior encounter produces a specific kind of person that institutions cannot easily control. A person who has made genuine contact with their own depths, who has found the source of meaning inside themselves rather than receiving it from an external authority, is fundamentally harder to manage. They're harder to shame because they've already faced the worst of what's inside them. They're harder to manipulate through approval and disapproval because their sense of worth isn't dependent on external validation. They're harder to keep in roles that don't fit because they've felt what it's like when something does fit, and the contrast makes the ill-fitting role unbearable. They're harder to sell to because the emptiness that consumption is designed to temporarily fill has been addressed at its source. This isn't a conspiracy theory. Jung would have been the first to reject that framing. Institutions don't suppress the interior encounter through coordinated effort. They suppress it through structure, through the way education is designed to produce functional workers rather than self-aware individuals, through the way religion is often organized to deliver belief systems rather than facilitate direct experience, through the way therapy frequently aims to restore functioning, to get you back to the surface where you can be productive again, rather than to support the descent into the depths where the real material lives. Through the way every mechanism of daily life, from the alarm clock to the evening scroll through your phone, keeps attention locked on the surface layer of experience. The Red Book sits outside all of these structures. It was written by a man who had stepped outside his own institutional identity, who had lost it really, when the Freud rupture tore away his professional belonging, and who went where no institution wanted him to go. What he brought back was a document that essentially says, the most important territory in human experience is the one every institution in your life has been designed to keep you away from. The locked room isn't just inside you, it's inside every system you participate in. And the locks on those systems are older and stronger than the ones on your own psyche. Which brings us to the part of this that stops being about Jung and starts being about you. And I want to be honest about what I'm about to do, because it would be easy to let this remain intellectual, to keep it at the level of history and philosophy and fascinating ideas about a fascinating man, and never let it become personal. The Red Book itself can be consumed that way. Thousands of people have bought the published edition, admired the paintings, read scholarly analyses, and walked away with their interior life completely untouched. The book allows this. Jung even predicted it. He knew that most people who encountered his work would find a way to appreciate it from a safe distance, the way you might appreciate a fire through glass, close enough to see the light, far enough to avoid the heat. What the Red Book actually asks, underneath the illuminated pages and the calligraphy and the mythological figures, is something far less comfortable than appreciation. It asks you to admit what you already know about the room you've been keeping locked. You know it's there. You've known for a long time. You feel it in the particular quality of silence that arrives when the distractions stop. Late at night, early in the morning, during those stretches where nothing is technically wrong, and yet something is clearly, unmistakably off. You feel it in the gap between the person you present to the world and the person who exists when no one is watching. You feel it in the relationships where you perform closeness without actually letting anyone near the thing you're carrying. You feel it in the career that makes sense on paper and produces a specific kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with how many hours you worked. The Red Book's argument is that this avoidance has a cost, and the cost isn't moral, it's energetic. The amount of psychological energy required to keep a room locked, year after year, decade after decade, is staggering. That energy doesn't disappear. It gets subtracted from everything else, from your capacity for joy, which gets thinner the longer the room stays sealed, from your ability to connect, which remains limited to whatever depth the performance allows, from your creative life, which can only draw on the material you're willing to acknowledge, from your physical body, which carries the tension of the locking in ways that accumulate and eventually announce themselves as symptoms your doctor can name but can't quite explain. And here's the layer beneath that, the one that functions as the Red Book's uncomfortable mirror. Most people who hear about this book, who listen to descriptions of what Jung found, who feel something stir in response to the idea of the spirit of the depths, most of them will do absolutely nothing with it. They'll find it fascinating. They'll agree with it intellectually. They might even feel a moment of genuine recognition, a flash of, yes, there is a room, I do know it's there. And then they'll close that recognition back down, return to the surface, and continue living exactly as they were. The Red Book will become another piece of interesting content they consumed, another idea they appreciated from behind glass. Jung watched this happen constantly during his lifetime. People would come to him having read his work, deeply moved, full of questions and enthusiasm. And he would ask them, have you sat with your own unconscious? Have you gone into the room? Have you done the thing the work is describing, or have you only read about it? And the silence that followed that question told him everything, Because reading about the descent and making the descent are separated by exactly the same distance that separates knowing you should change your life and actually changing it. The knowledge changes nothing. The encounter changes everything. What people find when they actually go into the room, the ones who can't maintain the avoidance any longer, whose locking mechanisms have finally worn through, is rarely what they expected. The spiritual marketplace promises light and connection and a sense of cosmic belonging. The therapeutic marketplace promises insight and resolution and a clear narrative that explains your pain. What the room actually contains is considerably messier than either promise. You find contradictions. You find that you're capable of genuine cruelty, that the capacity lives in you fully formed, and that the person you've been performing as incapable of it was a construction designed to keep you from having to sit with that knowledge. You find desires that embarrass you, not because they're dramatic or criminal, but because they're honest in ways that expose how much of your performed life is a lie. You find grief that has been sitting in the same position for years, sometimes decades, unmoved because you never gave it permission to move. You find rage that has been carefully converted into something socially palatable, patience, politeness, chronic accommodation, but remains rage, still hot, still intact, still shaping every interaction where you swallow what you actually want to say. And you find something else, something Jung documented across hundreds of encounters, both his own and his patients. Underneath the contradictions, underneath the uncomfortable desires and the unmoved grief and the converted rage, underneath all of it, there is a center of gravity that has been there your entire life, waiting with a patience that borders on geological. Jung called it the self, with a capital S, distinguishing it from the ego self that manages your daily performance. The self doesn't care about your career. It has no opinion about your social presentation. It isn't interested in the story you tell about yourself at dinner parties. What it is interested in, what it has always been interested in, is whether you will ever stop performing long enough to make contact with what's actually here. This is the part that scares people, and for good reason, because contact with the self, in Jung's account, is irreversible. You can lock the room again afterward, people do, but you can't unknow what you found in there. You can't return to the performance with the same conviction you had before you saw what was underneath it. The performance becomes transparent to you. You can see through it while you're doing it, and that transparency changes the experience of everything. Your relationships, your work, your sense of what matters, your tolerance for the particular brand of emptiness that fills a life lived entirely on the surface. After everything the Red Book documents, the visions, the figures, the 16 years of descent, the paintings, the calligraphy, the confrontation with forces that felt more real than the external world, Jung arrived at one final claim, and it's the one that ties the entire book together, the one that makes it dangerous rather than merely interesting, the one that both religious and scientific institutions have been trying to neutralize ever since the book was published. The claim is this: the world most people treat as primary, the external world of objects and events and measurable phenomena, the world you can photograph and optimize and share, is a surface. A vivid, consequential, undeniably real surface, but a surface nonetheless. And beneath it is a layer of reality that is older, denser, and in some essential sense, prior, because it is the layer that generates the surface, shapes it, gives it whatever meaning it carries, and persists in ways that individual consciousness does not. If this is even partially true, then the entire orientation of modern life is pointed in the wrong direction. We are spending the overwhelming majority of our attention, our energy, our years on the surface layer. We are building careers on the surface, building relationships on the surface, seeking meaning on the surface, and the layer that actually generates meaning, the layer beneath, the depths, the room, receives almost none of our attention. We pass over it every day. We feel its presence in the quiet moments we rush to fill. We sense its weight in the particular quality of 4 a.m. awareness that disappears the moment the alarm goes off and the surface reclaims us. Lives built entirely on the surface feel exactly the way they feel to the people living them. Technically functional, increasingly hollow, full of achievement that doesn't reach anywhere. The Red Book suggests this hollowness isn't a failure of effort or a mistake in strategy. It's the inevitable result of inhabiting only the visible room while the one that matters most stays locked, year after year, its contents pressing against the door with a patience that doesn't diminish. The Red Book was locked in a Swiss bank vault for 48 years. The lock was eventually opened, and what was inside changed how we understand the human psyche. But that story, the external story, the publishing history, the scholarly drama, has always been the less important version. The more important version is the one that has nothing to do with a book in a vault, and everything to do with the room you recognize from the inside. You can know that the Red Book exists. You can find it brilliant, find Jung's courage extraordinary, admire the illuminated pages, quote the spirit of the depths in conversation, and none of it will touch you. The knowledge will sit in the same place all intellectual knowledge sits, on the surface, where it's interesting, where it's safe, where it changes nothing about the way you wake up tomorrow morning and move through another day with the door still closed. Or you can hear what the book is actually saying, that there is a layer of your own reality you have never entered, that it is shaping your life regardless of whether you acknowledge it. That entry requires something that has nothing to do with intelligence or courage in the conventional sense, and everything to do with willingness. The willingness to stop performing long enough to find out what's underneath the performance. What that looks like, practically, is smaller than you'd think. It doesn't look like Jung sitting in a chair letting visions overtake him. For most people, it begins with a few minutes of sitting in silence without reaching for the phone, without filling the space with plans, without narrating the experience to yourself as it happens. It begins with a question asked genuinely, with the actual intention of hearing the answer. What am I feeling right now, underneath the feeling I'm performing? It begins with the decision to stop explaining yourself to yourself, just for a moment, just long enough to notice what's there when the explanation stops. Jung was not a mystic, despite what his detractors spent decades claiming. He was an empiricist who followed the evidence wherever it led, including into territory that respectable science refused to follow him into. What he found was dangerous because it was specific, because it wasn't about some abstract human being in a textbook. It was about the particular configuration of a real person's interior life. First his own, then his patient's, and now, whether you intended this or not when you started listening, yours. The Red Book is dangerous because the reality it describes isn't far away. It isn't historical. It isn't philosophical. It's underneath you, right now, in the room you can feel even as you hear these words. Patient as it has always been, and considerably more interested in being found than you might have been led to believe. If something in this reached the room you've been keeping sealed, if you felt the knock from underneath, even faintly, even for a moment you're already trying to explain away, the reflection exercises in true self-discovery were built for exactly what comes after that knock. 24 practices rooted in Jung's own approach to the descent, designed for the moment when you stop reading about the room and decide to open the door. Click below to get true self-discovery.